essentially, up until sort of 1976, South Africa, following British law, had a definition of riot, which was just general social unrest in some shape or form in some sort of organization. It was part of the general insurance coverage that was available at the time. And most certainly, some people took it, some people didn't take it, because it was relatively expensive. As the communities took up, the black communities took up the call to make the country ungovernable, the insurance industry realized that this was not going to stop, that in some way it was going to be escalated. The insurance companies, of course, now understood that this idea of riots and providing cover and so on was not sustainable for them. They grew very fearful that they were going to see many millions being paid in claims. The reality was that most of the damage that was occurring in black areas and in township areas, and so those people didn't really have insurance. So something needed to happen. So from normal riot, strike, malicious damage cover, we went into an apprehensive period until eventually some insurers just said, you know what, we're not going to do it. And they then put pressure on the government to provide insurance or to provide a guarantee of some kind that in the event of the insurance industry running out of cash, that the government would be the insurer of last resort. And that is really what gave birth to the idea that Sasria should be a separate association. With that idea, we then were able to write an insurance policy that sort of stood on its own, and that was then added on to an existing policy. Separate premiums were collected, and so the insurers were able to decide when they were paying claims from their own funds and when they were actually recovering the funds from Sasria, from the association. The government decided that while they would be the insurer of last resort, there also had to be some rules around when that would actually happen. And so it was an understanding that they would be the insurer of last resort, but the managers of the fund, which was the Insurance Association, they then tried to protect that fund by arranging a lot of reinsurance. And so most of that money that they accumulated went in commissions to what was then termed reinsurance brokers, into reinsurance companies. Many of them were private consortiums of Lloyd's agents, which were incorporated in tax havens like Guernsey, Isle of Man, and so on, off the UK. Some of them in Crete, and some sort of tax havens. So a lot of people were making a small fortune out of this. Because bear in mind, the facts never changed. The damage that was taking place, by and large, were happening in traditional black and colored townships. There were some damage that was caused to, shall we say, white companies or organized formal organizations, but not very much. Not very much. And so the funds were largely claims free. And so, billions were leaving South Africa, to the extent that, a number of people started saying, well, maybe we should be creating our own vehicle to do that in South Africa. And I have no doubt that if it had been left, if nothing really changed, that loss experience would have gone back, and insurance companies would have gone back to putting riot, strike, malicious damage back into their policies, forgotten about the idea of political riots, and just carried on business as usual. So Sasria then is now an association within SAIA. Time is now moving on. We're now getting into a new dispensation. 1994 arrives, and the government is still the insurer of last resort. At the time, I was a young activist, and I was involved with the government at that stage to try and look to see how do we get control of some of these assets. And we have a look at Sasria. We look at the experience. We look at what has happened. And government decides that if they are going to be the insurers of last resort, then they are in fact the insurer. And so we will take this business onto our balance sheet. And there was hell to pay. At that stage, the reserves just in Sasria locally was about 15 billion rand. We entered into negotiations. Cyril Ramaphosa at the time headed the government delegation and engaged with SAIA around this. And there was strong resistance from the market because they didn't want, they claimed that the insurance industry was now being nationalized, and you know, this was anathema to the idea of capitalism and all the rest of it. Government stood their ground, decided that they were going to take it back, that they were going to run it as a state-owned company. And eventually we negotiated with SAIA to move this association out, and it became a government entity. And in 1999 it became a state-owned company. There was a special act of parliament that needed to be passed and so on, you know, to bring it all into being. So they then repatriate the cash out of the company, 15 billion. And they replaced the capital with a state guarantee. And that was probably one of the best things that Sasria ever did. Sasria was now removed from the Insurance Association. But remember now, it was really just a post office. So it had a very small team of people. The guy that was in charge, the MD, had been a SAIA employee. And he had a few people around him to manage the place. And so, in fact, the organization for Sasria still largely sat in the individual insurance companies. And there was no way you could build a sustainable state-owned company when that was the situation. And it took us quite a long period of transition to get us through from that kind of organization where it was just a loose association into what it is today, which is a standalone independent insurer of international renown and repute. And when I then subsequently joined the company as a director around 2000, one of the tasks that I took upon myself was then to transition Sasria from being an internal insurance department of a large insurance association to an independent entity, in its own right. Transforming anything, any entity to take an entity from what it is to take it into something that it is to become is a journey with lots of pain and heartache. When Cyril becomes the chairman of the company, so that's government really signaling that they are in charge. That in itself was transformative for the insurance industry, because the insurance industry would have been quite happy to continue to take that business back onto its own balance sheets. And in fact, there were many approaches made from individual companies, in the association to government to say, well, guys, why don't you let us do this for you? Or if you like, we'll do it on our own balance sheet. Sell it to us. We'll buy it from you. Since you've already stepped away. And so that was the first battle, that to resist that temptation and that pressure to just sell the company back to the industry outright. And trust me, that was a sustained pressure for certainly 10, 15 years. That was my first area of engagement in advising government. Under no circumstances just sell this thing. It's been created, we've got it there, we can actually make this work. And it was really around my engagement at that time that Cyril then came and said, well, why don't you just join this board? Then we've got you. So there were some things then that we looked at when we came in to say, okay, what do we do? How do we transition it from this department? And the first thing was that we needed to make the company more independent. So the company needed to take on its own processes insofar as it could, and take on as much as it could. Now, at this time, all the financials are being prepared by the Insurance Association. They're helping in inverted commas, the team at Sasria, because they're all ex-SAIA employees, to help them prepare things like budgets and stuff. I mean the program on which the budgets were run had been provided to them by an insurance company that I'd been associated for a big part of my career. So this company was completely and totally integrated with the existing Insurance Association. It was part of it. And so one didn't want to divorce because that would create too much tumult. The company itself, Sasria itself, was too weak in any case to stand on its own. It just couldn't do that. So we started by creating our own market relationship groups. And so the first group of people that we took in were people who could integrate and work with the broader insurance market. So the first thing to do was to make sure that we established relationships with the insurance brokers, and so we started a marketing department. And through that division, we were able to then start to bring in people of color. Getting people at that level, that caliber, who could run an insurance company on that basis was not easy if you were looking for someone of color. So we had to develop our management team. What we finally decided to do was to almost step the board in as interim managers, and we appointed an acting CEO, and that's really where Cedric came in. He was one of the most qualified insurance professionals that Sasria had recruited up until that time. And we stepped him in as the temporary CEO, and we brought in some other executives around him, finance. We elevated the sales position. We actually put a management team around him. The first objective was, and that was in Cedric's first term, was to consolidate the operational effectiveness of Sasria. Because Sasria was regarded as a pariah company. If you wanted anything done in the insurance industry, the last people you go to was Sasria. People used to tell them which claims to pay, which claims not to pay. I mean, it really was a completely, totally untenable situation for any professional organization to live through. And so we gradually had to take those controls back. We had established independent relationships with the insurance intermediaries, and all those subcategories, intermediated categories of businesses that the insurers got their business from, we had established independent relationships with them. So the tide was turning. We drafted independent contracts, sales contracts, and support contracts with these intermediaries. So there was no longer a single channel of entry of business into Sasria. We set up a complaints facility where customers could complain long before the regulators insisted that complaints officers were to be appointed. We'd already done that. And so that was all part of the transformative journey. We engaged with the regulators in terms of their educational programs and the stuff that they were doing. We assisted and sponsored actuarial students with a focus on producing black actuaries. That's where it started. But eventually, and over a relatively short period, we were supporting students of all color. We see state-owned enterprises failing miserably. We see rampant corruption, and generally we see failure. I mean, Sasria now is one of the top 3 insurance companies of its type in the world. We are right up there. And if you look at where we come from, and the fact that we managed to do that over a period of roughly 8 years, I think it was a remarkable journey. I've always referred to Sasria as one of South Africa's best kept secrets, because it is a real success story of transformation and contribution in the most positive way, and I think represents the ideals of what South Africans can achieve if they just get over themselves.